My life is a documentary, not a sermon. I'm not telling you what to do, but this is what works for me.
This is Milan, an artist, entrepreneur, podcast host, author, and self-mastery coach for high performers.
Everything first begins in the mind. There's never been an action that precedes a thought. There's often a lag between identity and reality.
He's built a 7-figure e-commerce business, opened a restaurant, and grown an audience of well over 100,000, with conversations reaching millions of people.
The belief and the thought will generate the action will create evidence, and then the evidence will create conviction. I can continue down this path and I know I have the conviction I can fix what I previously built, or is it actually an opportunity to pivot into what I'm supposed to be doing?
At the core of it all, he spent years studying, developing, and sharing frameworks around self-mastery, alignment, and identity, the foundations he believes people build their lives on.
I think it's about the coherence of mind, body, and spirit. The skill is being able to train yourself to have the foresight that it will make sense in hindsight.
We sat down to unpack his story, his philosophy on inner mastery and strong foundations, and explore the mindset and worldview he's developed along the way.
It sounds and feels delusional to everyone else. As long as it doesn't to yourself, then you're in the right place, and that's how you know you're going to get to where you're going to get to.
Milan, welcome to Delusion by Design.
Thank you for having me, bro.
No, huge pleasure, and yeah, I've been looking forward to this one.
For sure.
But before we get started, for those that don't know you, who is Milan and what does he do?
Yeah, sure. So I honestly never know where to start when it comes to introducing myself, but I guess now I would consider myself podcast host, writer. First and foremost, I think I always put myself as an artist first before entrepreneur because, well, I guess we'll dive into the story, but before I got into business, I think I considered everything more as an art before it was a business. So yeah, that's the TLDR.
Love it, man. Yeah, so I mean, we'll go into all kinds of topics and your story as well, but before we do, I want to focus a bit on what you're doing now at the moment. So I know you work with founders, creators, professionals who are high performers. So, to kick us off, what does being a high performer actually mean to you?
That's a great question. And there's a podcast called the High Performance Podcast, and they often ask this question. But to me, the principle that stands out is the alignment of your inner mastery and your outer execution. I think when you marry these two is when you get truly high performance.
Interesting. And across the high performers you've met and, some of the ones you've worked with as well, what would you say are like common mental blocks or challenges that they tend to face?
It actually all tends to be around limiting beliefs or narratives that they were told, growing up, and patterns they're not aware of. And a lot of the time that comes down to not having the time to think or having the mirror to see these unconscious programs or whatever's tangled in their mind. They haven't given it the right time and attention to actually untangle,
And do you think that people who aren't necessarily high performers would struggle from or benefit from solving the same kinds of issues, or do they have like different kind of things to tackle first?
I 100% think that the foundation of anything that you pursue first begins with your foundation, right? So if you build on a rocky foundation, then whatever you build is going to collapse at some point. And so someone asked me the other day, how would you summarize what you do in one line? And I think, or your concept of what you do. And I think it's that the successful pursuit of anything external first begins with the inner pursuit of mastery. So if you build that foundation, then I think not only can you get results faster, but you'll be able to sustain them in the long term.
And I want to dig into that concept of mastery as well as foundations as well with you. But even before that, like, how did you come to a conclusion that these were the kind of problems and like the challenges you wanted to solve?
Yeah, I think it's pattern recognition in myself and amongst the people that I spoke to. I'm an avid reader, so I've read a lot of biographies and I'm obsessed over a lot of documentaries of like high performers, whether it's The Last Dance or Steve Jobs' biography or whatever it may be. And it seemed that the common thread like amongst them all is that they all have some level of inner conviction and inner mastery and inner, like, let's call it delusion by design. And to me, that showed me that obviously everything first begins in the mind, and I think that's the first principle of any sort of, whether it's esoteric book or spiritual book, spiritual principle, that, everything first begins in the mind. There's never been an action that precedes a thought,
Interesting. And with the actual work you do nowadays, I've seen you use the word container to kind of describe, the situation, the setup that you have. What does that word mean to you in practice?
I think a lot of it is, like I said, acting as a mirror for their unconscious patterns, and whether that's, that comes in the form of optimizing routines or discovering blind spots that they might not be aware of. And I think I'm only in a position to do this because I've done it for myself multiple times, and once you see, there's only a number of patterns that can actually exist, and tangibly what it looks like, I think it's the micro adjustments. And to be honest, I think the through line of what today's conversation will be is about awareness and raising your own awareness to the level that you are no longer blind to your own patterns and your own tendencies.
Oh, beautiful. And, we'll spend time throughout kind of digging into the different episodes of what you've done, but specifically on your show, I've learned a lot from it. I'm sure others have too. But if you had to break down a stream of consciousness into one central idea, what would that be?
Oof. I think it's that truth has many entry points. And so what I mean by that is, what you'll find on my show is I have a lot of guests that are contradictory in nature. When you look at them on the surface, you think these two people are completely different. But actually what you'll find is they both arrive at a very similar conclusion when it comes to certain ideas. I believe there are some sort of objective truths, and that's what I mean by truth has many entry points, so you can arrive to it one way or another way, and it doesn't necessarily mean one way is right or another is wrong. I think it's about that pursuit of truth.
And the truth itself is an objective.
Well, I was just talking about this with a friend. I think truth by default helps unify, and the illusion that we fall into is separation.
And if you had to kind of draw a through line between the different guests you've had, like any kind of commonalities and patterns, because you mentioned there's people from all different walks of life, but what would you say they have in common?
I think they've all achieved mastery in a specific area. If you look at each of them individually, some you may like, some you may not like, but they all have they've attained some level of mastery in a very specific area, whether it's writing, whether it's nutrition, whether it's bodybuilding, whatever it may be. And in those pursuits of mastery, there are threads of truth,
Definitely. And, even from watching your episodes and some of the points you've brought up, I've noticed that the concept of failure tends to come up quite a bit. So how have you kind of grown to perceive failure as a concept, as a tool?
Yeah, I never really had a negative view on failure. I think obviously when you fail, it doesn't feel good, of course, but the main reframe that I went through mentally was failure is just data. Data is information. Information is something that can be iterated on. And so without that failure, you wouldn't have that iteration that would eventually lead you to that success. So I think the mental reframe is that failure is like a necessary step, to get to on the pursuit of anything, I think.
So failure doesn't have to involve suffering or pain necessarily?
I think it's optional. Yeah. I think that's just a matter of perspective.
Do you think mastery needs to involve suffering or pain?
Well, it's kind of like that question of does great art require pain and suffering? And I'm not going to say that it doesn't, and because if you look at the greatest pieces of art in the world that has ever existed or been created, it usually does come from a deep kind of place of pain. All of these people that people quote, Nietzsche or Kafka or Van Gogh's paintings, they were all deeply unhappy. So yeah, I guess the answer is right there.
And yeah, we'll be, linking back to different aspects and things you explore on your show throughout. But I'd love to spend some time kind of digging through your own journey and your own story and how you've gotten to where you are now. So before anything, it would be amazing if you could kind of give us a speed run on the different steps you took and how you got to the version of yourself now.
Yeah, sure. So I was born. No, I'm joking. I I think I'll just fast forward to like 14, 15, right? That was typical entrepreneur story, selling sweets on the playground. Got a taste of what making money was like and being my own boss, quote unquote. And luckily I was exposed to, I think, the right pieces of information that kind of planted these seeds in my mind, whether it was through family members or it was through what I was watching online. And so I started to pick up the books, the very entry-level books, the Rich Dad, Poor Dads, even more of the spiritual ones like Law of Attraction, like The Secret or whatever it may be. And these planted the ideas in my mind that there's no traditional path for me, because it hasn't been trod yet. And so I actually wrote an email yesterday of all of the things that I've done, and it surprised me, to be honest. It's been about 11 or 12 or 13 probably different businesses. And so I won't go into the details, but I've had an affiliate marketing business. I've used to grow Instagram pages and sell them. I used to do social media marketing for brands and for business owners. I used to do freelance graphic design. But my major breakthrough, quote unquote, was when I dropped out of university at 18 with no real plan. Went to Bali with my loss of my student loan, and made a plan out there of like what is it I'm going to try and lock in on. And e-commerce is what I landed on because I'd collected so many skills beforehand that actually would complement this business model. And yeah, I think 4 or 5 businesses or stores into e-commerce, we had our sort of success. And this is, I partnered with a friend of mine, and that was my main focus for 2 or 3 years. And bootstrapped that, built it to like multi 7 figures. And then that opened the gateway to go into more brick and mortar businesses. So I opened a restaurant, and as you know, in London at 22, and quickly exited that as well a year and a half later. And yeah, here we are, like the pivot. And I'm sure you're going to ask about the inflection points and whatnot, but the pivot was at 23 when I walked away from both and realized my quote unquote true calling, or what my intuition was telling me, was in sharing the ideas that I've learned and extracting these sort of principles and wisdom from the high performers that I have on my show. And yeah, like 2.5 years later, I think that's where we are now.
So it was while you were actually going through the journey that you were building up the kind of, I guess, knowledge-based wisdom that you're now sharing.
Yeah, I think it's unconscious. Like I wasn't ever. I never want to position myself as a guru, quote unquote. I'm just sharing. Something Alex Hormozy said I loved was, my life is a documentary, not a sermon. And that's exactly how I want to share the things that I've learned along the way. This is what worked for me. I'm not telling you what to do, but this is what works for me. And yeah, I think that is where the sort of knowledge base began to grow. And it's the student's mind, right? It never ends. The pursuit never ends.
And to focus on a few of the key points in there. So you mentioned the e-com store that was doing very well for you. And then, you ended up getting into the restaurant business. When you look back at that, how do you reflect on that switch from something that was kind of practical to something that was, I imagine, a bit more of a passion for you?
You mean from the restaurant into what I'm doing now, or do you mean from e-com into the restaurant?
Yeah, e-com into the restaurant.
That wasn't a passion, actually. It was an opportunity. And at the time, it felt stupid not to take, because, you hear all this programming when you're younger of diversify your income and, have multiple income streams. And I kind of fell for that propaganda very early on without securing my foundations first. And so in looking back, I wouldn't consider it a mistake, because very valuable lessons, but expensive lessons were learned. So I think it was a pivot that felt necessary at the time.
And you were doing both for a while.
Yeah, like a year and a half, I think. Yeah.
Okay. And do you think those experiences served you?
Oh, 100%. Like again, it's about the failure thing, There's so many micro lessons I think I picked up in that time, or that identity of the person I was back then, that serve me today, whether it's people management, people skills, learning how to talk to people and hire people. Coming from a digital business, you can hire people online from across the world, and you don't have to really speak to them. I mean, you do, but not in person. Whereas when we switched to the restaurant, We're like, oh, okay, so we have to find someone competent, skilled, and within a 3 mile radius, And so it became a lot more about learning how to manage people, especially in such a small space, and the psychology behind that as well. So it was very interesting.
And a few years ago, you told me that your tagline at the time was e-commerce, restaurants, and more. And nowadays that more side is
More. Yeah.
your main thing, right? So was there any change like within you that led to that more side being at the center of it? Or was that more dictated by external factors?
It's a great question. I think both, honestly. I believe that there are certain points, and like you said, inflection points, in which you have to make a decision and you come to a crossroads. And 2023 was when that happened for me. I was at a point where both our businesses were doing pretty well. But, as the saying goes, when it rains, it pours. So, we had something happen within our ecom business that it was essentially sabotaged. And we, immediately had to kind of stop operations. And at the same time, the restaurant wasn't doing too well at the same time as well. And so I was at a crossroads of, it was really a moment of reflection. It was, okay, what is this whole situation trying to tell me? And I honestly think a lot of the spiritual training that I had beforehand helped me in this situation, because I saw that as divine intervention. Okay, I can continue down this path, and I know I have the conviction I can fix what I previously built, or is it actually an opportunity to pivot into what I'm supposed to be doing? And I just posted this quote the other day. I believe it's from Carl Jung, but he said that if the path ahead of you is clear, then you're probably on someone else's. And I think the principle applied. I could see exactly where I was going on the old path, and it wasn't really where I wanted to go.
And I heard you say in your episode with Sahil Bloom that you were halfway up a mountain with a business you didn't want to be in, and then you took time and corrected course. Was this the occasion, or was that a separate time?
Yeah, that was exactly the occasion. Yeah, because that was the inflection point of, okay, do I go all in and fix it, or is this the time to pivot? And is this literally, the divine telling me this is your opportunity to pivot, now more than ever?
How did you realize that wasn't the game you wanted to play?
Again, I think it was looking at the long-term consequences of remaining on that path. There's that Naval saying, play stupid games, win stupid prizes. And not that it was a stupid game I was in, but I realized I didn't want to be known for being the e-com guy or being the restaurant guy, or just to make a lot of money. I think that was the point in which I realized there is a deeper calling that I need to work on unfolding.
Would you describe that calling as like your North Star?
Yeah, I mean, that's why I have it tattooed on me. Like, that's something I always come back to.
The North Star?
Yeah.
And how did you actually get clear on defining that for yourself?
I think a lot of contemplation, silence, but you have to be careful when you enter these bouts of contemplation and meditation and prayer, whatever it may be, that it doesn't spiral into rumination, But again, I think you have this sort of intuitive knowing that you're meant to be doing more with yourself. And if anyone is like listening, they're ambitious, they have that too, within them. I know I'm meant to be doing more, but I'm not sure what it is. But you have certain signs. I posted something recently that said, a spiritual teacher once told me that you can smell the ocean before you see it, right? And so what that means is when you start walking the path, you will start to get signs or synchronicities that you are on the right path, that things are, arriving to you. The sea is there. You just, it's just not in your personal horizon at the moment. Like you can't visualize it, but it's there, and so when I started getting those little synchronicities and signs, and I was being in the right rooms, or the right opportunities started to come to me, I realized, okay, I am walking the path.
And that path itself led you to publishing content.
Yeah. And initially it wasn't with the intent to build out what I'm doing now. Actually, it was just, I read this book called The Creative Act by Rick Rubin, which is one of my favorites. And his whole philosophy is create for an audience of one, which is yourself. And that's exactly what I was doing. And to this day, everything I post is honestly just a reminder to myself. And so that was the intention in which I started sharing content.
And when you started sharing it, you were posting it under Untethered as a brand.
Yeah. I mean, big story behind that as well. That was kind of like, sounds crazy, but the idea did come to me in in like a dream, and call it prophecy or whatnot. But I realized that at that point I had a newsletter and I was sending out newsletters and people were liking it, but it was only within my sort of friendship circle. And I realized I needed a vehicle to grow this, and I wasn't, I still had the fear of being seen and imposter syndrome. So I thought to do it faceless and build a brand around it. And yeah, that essentially started sharing ideas on there, and that page kind of like blew up. And then eventually, once I got over the fear of being seen and whatnot, that's when I started pivoting into personal content.
So I'll dig into those different parts separately, but Untethered specifically as a concept and breaking the loop as a whole, what does that idea mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many layers to it when you actually break it down. So on the first layer, it could mean breaking the loops, breaking mental loops that you might have, for example, your tendencies or your patterns. And then on a more spiritual level, let's say, within Hinduism or the Vedic scriptures, there's this idea of samsara, and it's essentially reincarnation, and you re-enter this loop of life, death, and rebirth. And so the goal is to attain what is called moksha, which is liberation, and when you return to your creator, essentially, right? And so that in itself is also breaking the loop. And I saw this as a way to share the ideas that I think can kind of help you get there in a way. I'm not saying I have the answers, but that was the idea behind it.
That was the concept. And did it represent something specific in your own life?
Not necessarily. No, I think it was just an idea and I ran with it.
It's a concept. And why did you decide to make more of a pivot into having a personal brand as opposed to a theme page, brand page?
I think I realized the play was, okay, I could turn this into a business and I could, turn this into whatever it's going to turn into and sell the business. Like, for example, there's this book 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel, and there's another book called Built to Sell. And essentially the core idea is you have to build something to sell it. You have to have something like a vehicle. And so I saw that more as a vehicle. And what I saw working long term, if I actually wanted to reach people and move people, it has to be face to face. People buy from people, people trust people. And so, yeah, I think it was a no-brainer. It was necessary. Like it was going to happen.
And you mentioned before, like the imposter syndrome, not wanting to be seen. I want to touch on the concept of identity a bit with you, because did you have to make a conscious identity shift? Were you aware of what you were doing when you decided to pivot into personal brand kind of content?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're always going through identity shifts. And so that's why I said earlier, the version of me that had the restaurant and the econ brand, that was multiple identities ago. I speak about this often, that there's often a lag between identity and reality, and you're kind of behind, because you don't have the evidence to prove to yourself that you are who you say you are. And so, yeah, it was for sure a conscious shift I had to make. I had to act as if, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think that fake it till you make it is, it has bad PR, but it's not a lie. It's a pretense to who you'll become.
Yeah, because even, the concept of fake itself is one thing, right? It's like, are you really faking it if you're acting as it?
Yeah, and obviously we can dive into philosophy of what's fake, what's real, what's truth, what's what's good, what's evil. I think that's all. It's all in the air. It's all subjective.
And do you think it's possible to achieve any kind of big goal without the self-image to back it?
Yes, I think you can, but I don't think it is sustainable. Like I said, I think it's like building on a rocky foundation. There are certainly people that achieve success without doing the inner work, but does it last? But I think people who have projected this image of who they're going to become, almost as an alter ego, as if like Michael Jordan had MJ, Kobe had Black Mamba, Beyonce had Sasha Fierce. Everyone has this alter ego that they create, and eventually they become inseparable. And so in the people I've observed that have the longest lasting level of sort of success and fulfillment, I feel like it begins with that inner image.
Yeah, because I wanted to ask you about that alter ego thing as well, right? So, like, if someone were listening to this and, you know, have heard it before, but it's essentially this concept of creating a version of yourself outside of yourself that you can kind of tap into, how do you think someone can use that to their advantage to actually help them, like, actualize the self-image that they want?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting because there's this whole idea of stay authentic, right, or be authentic. But how can you be authentic if you don't know what your values are? And so there's a guy called Dr. DiMartini, and my friend Tyler put me onto his work, and he has this amazing framework of figuring out what your values are, and not through claiming what they are, but through actually tracking back through your actions and where your time is allocated, and then figuring out what your values are. You know, so you can say your value is one thing. You know, you can say my highest value is doing deep work 2 hours a day, for example. But if someone was objectively watching you, and you're 4 hours a day you're on reels, that's clearly your highest value. You know, and so looping back to the point of this identity and this image, once you become aware of what your current values are, then I think you can begin changing them. There's no use in fooling yourself. I think you have to first become aware of those values, and there's a whole framework behind doing that that Dr. DiMartini shares that I highly recommend going through. And then designing what these values are of this highest identity, the highest version of yourself, and then using that as sort of an accountability partner. I think that's the best tangible way. Okay, what would me 2.0 do in this situation? And if you think about it through time, a lot of people have done this in different ways. This is not a new idea. In Christianity, there's what would Jesus do? In Hinduism, what would Krishna do? There's all of these higher selves, let's say, that we sort of refer to and hold ourselves accountable to, a standard.
What kind of things do you think someone has to be clear on or intentional about to be able to move towards a different self-perception, self-identity?
That's a good question. I think kind of what I just said, I think you can't lie to yourself. I think you have to be very honest about your current self-image. I think you have to get clear on what narratives are running in your mind at the moment, whether it's the stories you told yourself or the stories that other people told you about yourself, and then doing the work to sort of untangle that. And there's one question I sort of ask myself all the time is this even mine? You know, so if a limiting belief comes up, I have to ask myself, is this even mine? Because a lot of the times it's not. Fear is projected onto you a lot of the times through what you consume, you know, whether it's your environment or conversations or the people you're surrounded by. And so becoming very clear on, did this belief actually come from me, or was it projected onto me and I accepted it to be as true? I think that's a fundamental shift that you have to make. There's a great book called Psycho-Cybernetics, you've read it, and it talks a lot about this self-image. A lot of the people in the book, for anyone that doesn't know, you know, the guy's a plastic surgeon, and he makes major transformations in people, changes their nose and their eyes and whatever it may be. But when they look in the mirror, they still see that same old version of themselves. And I think that is the whole concept of identity lag as well.
Yeah, so on that specifically, you know, if someone decides to change their identity internally, but there is that lag to the external, how can they stay there without losing conviction or faith that they'll get there?
Yeah, it's difficult because the truth is, you know, there's this be, do, have thing, right? You have to be someone in order to do something, in order to have what it is you want. But the truth is, I think you only really have to focus on the work itself. And I don't say that in a hormozy way where like none of this inner work stuff matters. I'm the last person that will say that. But I do think, honestly, it's about stacking as much evidence as you can, despite what your mind is telling you, in order to prove to yourself that you are, you know, who you say you are.
Is there a way to kind of check or make sure that it is just a case of lag as opposed to you doing something fundamentally wrong?
I think this is where like self-audit comes in, self-examination. You know, a lot of people think that meditation is like a woo-woo kind of spiritual tool, but in fact, it's the greatest self-examination tool that has ever existed. And I think in those self-examination audits where you can truly be honest with yourself about your actions, and if your actions are not adding up to the result that you want, it could be a number of things. One, good things take time. but 2, you might actually be doing something wrong. And I think, again, really not lying to yourself is where the progress is made.
Yeah, so I mean, you mentioned meditation there. I was going to bring this in later, but you have this concept that I really like that you bring up called essentially like microdosing boredom, right? So would you consider boredom, meditation, possibly even walking within the same category, or do you view them as different things?
I think there's active meditation, and you can enter active meditation through things like walking, whether even it's synonymous with flow states, I think, as well, because you can enter meditative states or flow states during peak performance, whether it's the five-a-side game you're playing on a Sunday or the tennis match you're playing on a Tuesday. You can still enter those same sort of states. And I think they open up different neural pathways for you to come to different realizations, as opposed to kind of sitting down with yourself and being still alone with your thoughts. I think both are necessary. I would categorize them in the same sort of box, though, yeah.
Do you think breath work is something fundamentally different to that?
I think, again, it's another form of, let's call it neural activation. I think it activates different parts of your mind that can unlock insights that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise. And that's why I advocate a lot for journaling as well as like meditation, because when you actually get something down onto paper, you are literally using a different part of your brain, of your mind.
And recently I've seen you use the term Yogi Entrepreneur. What does that mean to you?
It was just a joke between a friend of mine. And I think it's just the combination of spiritual and logical, I would say. Because to be a great entrepreneur, I think you have to be very logical and decisive. But I think to create lasting fulfillment, to create a life that you actually enjoy, I think you need to take the path of the yogi as well. And the path of the yogi is interesting. I think I'm not claiming to be one, but I think they dedicate themselves to a higher cause, to a higher pursuit, a higher calling. And I think this is like, again, the marrying of the intuition and the logic.
Do you think that having that kind of yogi approach is like a prerequisite for success, or do you think it's an accelerator and an amplifier or a different way to see life?
Well, I guess it depends on your definition of success. What would you define success as?
Achieving the stated goal.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the goal as well. Like to make $1 million in a business, I don't think you need to do any sort of inner work or meditation or anything. Like I said, there's many entry points to the goal, but I think it's definitely, I think the term you used was an amplifier. I think that is pretty on the money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because even, a general point I wanted to bring up with you as well, like a lot of the very successful, especially older people that I know, base their worldview entirely on rationality, logic, relationships.
Yeah.
And it almost looks like they completely reject the spiritual side, or at the very least the religious side.
Yeah.
Do you think they've kind of left something on the table by doing that, or is it just a case of like each to their own?
I think they're unconsciously practicing spiritual insights anyway, but they just don't know it. Mm-hmm. I think Alex Hormozy, for example, who rejects manifestation and spirituality, I think he also practices these insights without him knowing consciously. It's just called a different thing, like the identity work and inner mastery. I think he achieves those same sort of outcomes and understandings through grit and excessive output. I think he can come to the same realization. So it's not a matter of people leaving things behind. I think it's just whether you're consciously aware of what it is that you're doing and what you sort of label.
Yeah, because before you mentioned the term foundations, right, and having solid foundation, I thought that was interesting because, firstly, to you, what does actually having solid foundations actually mean when it comes to your mind?
So there's a principle within the Gita, which is one of the Vedic texts, that says the mind that is situated in awareness is essentially, I'm paraphrasing, is the complete mind. And what that means is, if you cannot be thrown off course by chaos, by material attachments, by the news, by media, everyday circumstances, and you can maintain your equilibrium, I think that's what builds a solid foundation.
Mm. And a shaky foundation as opposed to that would be like emotionally reacting to things and
Yeah, reacting, not responding. You know, if something goes wrong and you have to put a fire out, you automatically identify with that fire. A lot of people attach their sense of self-worth to, let's say, their productivity or how well their business is doing. And I think the true, again, going back to the yogis, their sense of self is completely inwardly rooted. There's nothing external that can kind of shake them.
yeah, I had this conversation with a friend the other day, and he basically gave the metaphor of like being a paper in the wind and kind of drifting wherever it takes you, as opposed to being a rock kind of stood on your ground.
Mm. Yeah, I like it.
And you mentioned awareness as well, right? So when you speak about that, is it a term that you view as like awareness as a whole, or is it awareness of something specific? So like emotions or how you're feeling in a particular moment, or what influenced you? Yeah, like what does that term kind of signify to you?
I think awareness as a whole, because there are so many layers underneath, between what awareness can bring you. But awareness is essentially living in a conscious state of mind rather than on autopilot.
I've seen you say something along the lines of modern day spirituality basically just being a form of escapism. Why do you think people have kind of turned to spirituality, spiritual ideas, spiritual practices to actually escape?
Yeah, I mean, escapism is interesting because, and I think that's obviously, it's kind of out of context, that quote. I think that modern day spirituality, or call it neo-spirituality, is very much so taking concepts that are ancient and bending them and taking them out of context and bending them to how you, and interpreting it how you would like to interpret it. And so I think, people need escapism because there is something to escape from. And I think that's more a commentary on kind of the state of the world or the surroundings at the time. And it serves as a sort of an alternative for them, you know. I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. Again, I think there are many entryways into truth, but I also think that warping ancient principles, like there's a guy called Aleister Crowley who is the founder of like Satanism, you know, essentially. And a lot of his principles were warped, esoteric principles from ancient Vedic scriptures made modern. And so that's kind of what I meant in that initial statement.
And how do you think someone can actually take spiritual principles and learn them and apply them in a way that actually benefits them as opposed to lending to escapism?
Yeah. I think, again, this is the marrying of intangible to tangible, you know? So it's kind of like how you learn, like knowledge, right? You consciously consume, and then you do, and then you learn from that doing. So you have to have something to apply that to at the same time. So I think you can read and learn about all these spiritual principles, but in fact, it's about how are you putting it into practice? You know, so you can do the 2-hour meditations in the morning, but something I've learned is that the meditations themselves are not the practice. It's about preparing yourself to return back to that state when life throws the chaos at you. And so I think every day and every moment presents an opportunity to practice those principles.
You brought up knowledge, something I wanted to touch on. I mean, yeah, we'll go into books a little bit later, but how do you view the difference between knowledge and wisdom?
Yeah, so wisdom is just applied knowledge. That's the definition I would go for. And so you can collectively hoard knowledge, but if there's nowhere that you're actually applying it to, then you're not actually learning, in my opinion.
Do you think it's possible to develop wisdom through consumption and conversation alone, or does it require action by definition?
No, I think it requires action. Yeah, I mean, this is again in Vedic principles. This is what's called karma yoga. You know, it's the development of wisdom through action, and it's your duty to act. It's actually your dharma, your purpose. It is to act and to serve.
I mean, as a whole, are there certain lessons that you've read about before, you've then lived out, and had to experience them for yourself for you to actually be able to internalize them?
That's a great question. I think when it comes to the more meta concepts, there's this, a friend of mine told me that there's 3 ways that people learn. Some people only learn through doing. So you can tell them something, but they won't internalize it until they actually go and do it themselves. Some people can see and observe someone else or hear about it see someone doing it and learn from that. And some people can just hear about it. And I think with different lessons, we're all at different stages. So there are certain things that I can hear about someone doing and I can learn from them. But there are some things that I will have to go through myself as a paradigm that you have to walk through in order to understand. I think the age-old one is, and I'm not using me as an example, but the age-old one is money doesn't buy you happiness. I think, honestly, that's only a paradigm you will understand until you actually go through it.
100%. And I know you're someone who's read hundreds of books and, actually are able to internalize and speak about the lessons you've had. How are you intentional about actually retaining information and being able to apply it in day-to-day life?
Yeah, it's a great question. Again, because it becomes mental hoarding if you don't apply the information. And so you only learn through doing, again. So if you have a vehicle that you can apply these lessons to, then I think you learn 10 times faster and you internalize these lessons. If you go and talk to someone who's ran a business for 20 years, but they haven't picked up a single business book, they will know all these lessons, but it's because they've learned through doing. And so reading for me is not, Naval says it best, it's not to get ideas, but it's to spark ideas. Because what happens is every time you read about a certain concept and you apply it, it plants a seed, in your mind, and then you begin connecting dots and patterns and ideas. And so that's the process of, for me, how to sort of retain information.
So with the vehicle that you chose, right, the business that you're running, were you intentional about making content kind of like a way to express what you've been reading about and learning?
100%. Yeah, 1000%. And I'm lucky that I can come across a concept, I can learn and do and apply it, and then I can take away, what I've learned and then share it online. And then again, that's another form of retention. And so you don't have to post content in order to retain information. I think writing is a great vehicle for this as well. You can read for clarity, read for ideas and write for clarity. And so just writing to yourself or writing notes about a certain book that you're reading at the time, highlights. Ryan Holiday, if you go through how he reads books, there's thousands of underlines and post-it notes, and the book is all beaten up. And I think that is the correct way to read.
And I've seen you say that you read for an hour and you write for an hour a day. Aside from time itself, how do you choose what to actually write about? Because sometimes, for example, I'll open a journal or open a Google Doc and I'll start writing, but I'll either reflect on something or plan for something else. Are you intentional about choosing what exactly it is that you're going into and expressing through the writing?
I mean, it's very rare that I'll read something and then I'll go and write about it straight away. I think now I'm at the point where I have such a bank of ideas that I've written about before. I can go back and iterate on something that's worked before, something that people resonated with before. It's very rare, but on occasion I will kind of share what I really want to share at that moment. But this all comes down to, I guess, the system I've built around my writing.
In another one of your videos with Musa, you speak about the seeker mentality, right? And this concept of ignorance is bliss comes up at one point. So, I mean, I know you're someone like me who likes to, or at least has gone into a bunch of different rabbit holes about how the world works, who runs the world, darker topics in general.
Yeah.
Do you think it's worth going down these rabbit holes at all?
I shared something yesterday, 2 days ago, when I did a Q&A on my story, and someone asked me about something that came out recently and said, what do you think about this? This is crazy. And I said, I'm lucky I kind of went down these rabbit holes when I was younger because nothing surprises me anymore. And so in a way, I'm glad I kind of went down those rabbit holes when I was younger, and I had that sort of seeker trait to go and find out, okay, who's running the world, what's going on, why are they doing so and so. And the pattern that emerged was not to make it dark, but was the human capacity to do evil shouldn't surprise you anymore. But just as much on the other end is also the human capacity to laugh.
Oh, definitely. And, sometimes when you go down these dark rabbit holes and you realize like how fucked up things are, I think it's, at least in my experience, it's easy to get quite nihilistic or cynical about the world. But how have you learned to kind of look at life and look at the future without it being tainted by darkness with the context that you have?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I definitely had a period when I was like 16 or 17 where I thought, what's the point? Like if it's all controlled anyway and this and so happens when you get to a certain level, then what's the point? But then I think I started getting, one, you have to understand, if you're in the game, you have to play it regardless, Like you still have bills to pay, you have a family to feed. I think you have to play the game whilst you're in it. And then two, this whole concept of Maya, which is another spiritual term, that this is sort of an illusory experience. I think that sort of helped with understanding what was real and what wasn't. I think it's a bit of a meta concept, but that's how I internalized it.
So you're able to kind of go through life with the awareness and knowledge that you have of these things going on and not allow it to actually impact how you view the future or plan your own life.
Yeah, I think a lot of these sort of conspiracy theories and stuff, and it's good to go down the rabbit hole and on occasion and find out a lot about them, but I'd say the primary goal of them is to create separation between people. And I was talking about this with a friend, and I think the more there is separation, obviously the less there is unity. And I think unification is, the primary goal of good. And so the more you see it as, okay, the more I read into these conspiracies, the more I'm going to have an agenda, the more it's going to create this barrier of separation, then I think the less interested you become in them.
And how do you think someone can actually learn to draw the line between like what's useful knowledge and what's just, noise?
Yeah, so it's a whole signal versus noise thing, right? I use the example a lot of the radio station, right? Your mind's like a radio station, and whatever you tune it to will determine what you receive in terms of thoughts. And if you are receiving static, if you're in a state of confusion, if you can't see where you're going all the time, if you are constantly controlled by external narratives, then I think you're tuned into the noise. But once you get a glimpse of the signal, then I think that is when you can sort of make the shift and begin to use a bit of discernment.
How do you personally recognize when it's signal for you?
This is interesting because I was talking about how ideas land. I'm interested to hear for you as well how it happens. But for me, an idea will land, and how I know it's from source or from God is that it lands very subtly. Like it doesn't announce itself. It just lands and then it pulls at you to sort of co-create with it. And that for me is how I recognize signal. It doesn't have to shout or announce its arrival. For me, that is how I sort of recognize, okay, this is the thread I need to pull on. I'm curious for you, how is it?
I feel like it's associated with a feeling. And, we can go into this as well, but this whole notion of intuition, right? And following your gut. And again, you can go down multiple different paths with that. But the way I see it, it's like if you have a drawing to it, right? If you're being pulled to that, if the feeling is there, then there's something more to it. And especially the last few months, I've been traveling quite a bit, and I've been outside in places where I'm normally not, speaking to all kinds of different people. And I've found that it's tended to come more often, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think, does that kind of answer?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same idea. It's just this intuitive knowing that you just know that this is signal and this is not,
Yeah. So also from your episode with Sahil Bloom, one of the notes that I took was the over-examined life is not a life worth living. And I know you're someone who's very big on self-reflection. So At what point do you think reflection and analysis becomes kind of too much?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think earlier to my earlier point of reflection can quickly spiral into rumination if you're not careful. And the difference is with rumination is it sort of drags you through the past. And with reflection, you notice and observe what the patterns are, detached, emotionally detached from it. I don't think you can live in this mode of reflection 24/7. I don't think there's a certain time limit either. I think it's different for each individual. But you will know when you begin to spiral into rumination. When it begins to affect your action and your work and your day-to-day, then I think you're on the edge of analysis paralysis.
If you're someone who is kind of wired to seek meaning and look to understand and go deeper in different topics, how do you think you can kind of apply that? Like, because if you have intuitive knowledge of, okay, this has gone too far, but at the same time, you're always kind of looking to go further and deeper and understand more and, go on this quest for more and more. Do you ever see a line, or how could someone recognize that in themselves?
I think the quote I come back to is, I think it was Socrates that said that the only thing I know is that I know nothing at all. And once you understand that there's so much to learn, you kind of begin to draw the line on how deep you want to go on certain areas. If it doesn't serve you anymore, then I think that's where you sort of draw the line. Does this actually affect my day-to-day? Whether the earth is flat or not, does it actually affect my day-to-day? Probably not. So I think that's, again, where the discernment comes in.
And how are you kind of intentional about what you consume, what you read? Because, again, you read a lot. So how does that list get formed?
Yeah, conscious consumption. And I believe certain books, I think, just come to you. That's actually, I don't know if it was a marketing scheme or what, but Carl Jung's Red Book, that's what they say is this book finds you. I think that's how I consume, is I allow my sort of intuition to help me choose. And it sounds like such a woo-woo, like airy-fairy answer, but truth is your intuition is the purest form of logic, and it just filters through. And so I'm very intentional about who I speak to, who I surround myself with, who enters my sort of, Steve Jobs calls it his reality distortion field. And I think each of us in our own way kind of build our own version. And so, again, I think the biggest one that we have control over now is social media as well. Curating your feed intentionally, I think, is the number one ROI.
You brought up being an artist at the start. Do you consider the topics you speak about, the way you lead your life, to be more of an art or a science?
Great question. I consider myself an artist first because the first online money I ever made was from freelance graphic design. And so I actually literally physically had to learn how to create shapes and logos and whatnot. And that's kind of shaped how I create even to this day. And so I think there is a science to it, but there's that Da Vinci idea of everything connects to everything else. Understand the science of art and understand the art of science. I think it's a combination of both.
And what does being an artist in today's world mean to you?
Well, I think if you break down what artist means, right? Anyone who creates, and I think intuitively, innately, we are all creators in some way or form. Creation isn't reserved for paintings on a wall or creating marble blocks. It can be a piece of writing. It can be a conversation. This is also a type of creation. And so I think it's necessary. One of the points that Dan Coe made on my episode with him was that AI will allow humans to ascend to meaning by automating the meaningless tasks. And I think we're going to see a rise in individuality, hopefully. Those will rise to the top. And that will shape the narrative of the next generation, I think.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? Because with art and content, right, especially the way you do it, I love like the cinematography and the way that you approach things in general. On socials, there's always kind of that balance between like, okay, this is gonna increase retention. I'm going to get more watch time doing this. I'm going to be able to frame things in a specific way or clip it up to be able to do better, versus I feel the calling. I like the way this looks. Essentially science versus art when it comes to content specifically. Is that something you're kind of intentional about? Do you lean more into the art side? Like,
I think these days I'm leaning more into the science of it. But, in the early days, I was definitely very artist heavy. And I think I'm coming to some sort of an equilibrium now. I think both are necessary, honestly. You can't not play the game, because the whole notion of the starving artist is dead. And you can't, it's no longer admirable or noble to be a starving artist. So I think you do have to understand the science of it and play the game a little bit.
And I mean, even just to ask you, to do with your business specifically, how do you view the balance between what you offer in terms of coaching and one-on-one work with Performance Alchemy versus the actual content you make and the art behind it and the conversations and the guests you're having? Like, where do those kind of meet? How do they differ? How do you see the dance between the two?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's the principle I was taught, well, especially by like people like Alex Hormozy, is give it all away for free, And so there's nothing really in when I work with people one-to-one that is not out there online. It's just that it's curated and it's personalized. It's kind of like working with a PT, all the workouts are there for you online if you want to go and find it. But if you want like structured accountability and you want someone in your corner, I think that's where the transformational work takes place.
And, to touch on principles for a bit. So you mentioned Carl Jung, his Red Book. I know you like his quote, if you don't make the unconscious conscious, it'll direct your life and you'll call it fate. So I've been thinking a lot recently about how some people have a particular calling and feel drawn to a particular path early in life, and they know that that's the direction that they can see it through, while others just kind of do, and they go through life kind of on autopilot, right? So if they don't already have it kind of clear to them, how do you think someone can actually get clear on the direction that they want to go in?
Yeah, it's a great point, because I think a lot of people are lost on this, and I actually just made a post about this earlier, is that your childhood obsessions weren't distractions, they were prophecies. They were trying to point you in the direction of what it is you're supposed to do. It's your intuitive navigation, pointing you towards your gifts. And when you look at child prodigies like Mozart, who's composing music at 5, it's very evident that true interest is revealed early. And on the Founders Podcast, there's this notion of people don't have ideas, ideas have people. And so you just have to trek back far enough to think, okay, what was I obsessed with as a child? What did I notice that other people didn't? What feels natural to me but like work to others? And the more you kind of dive into that sort of questioning and asking people around you as well, like your parents or your peers who probably have a better objective view on you, the more you'll begin to see a pattern emerge. And from there, you can begin the process of experimentation. Again, Naval says it's 10,000 iterations towards mastery. And I think it's the same thing when it comes to finding purpose or finding what it is that you're supposed to do in life. It's all about experimenting and iterating and finding what is pulling at me, like intuitively, to go and do. Because if you ask someone, the average person, when's the last time you actually tried like something new when it comes to like discovering what it is you're supposed to do? They can mentally spin their wheels, but when do they physically go to that crochet class, or when did they go to build that business in that random niche? Probably never. And so I think there's a process of going back and finding the through line about your obsessions and then putting them into practice and trying different vehicles.
Do you think purpose is kind of like predefined?
It's a good question. I go back and forth on it a lot, but I do think that to quote Robert Greene, your destiny was encoded in you, before you arrived here.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I was having a conversation again with someone I know and respect, much older than I am, who's built his business, has the house, has the family, lives his life, and he was basically saying like he believes that your life is already scripted, and you're just
Yeah.
kind of going through it, and whatever you end up doing is exactly what you were supposed to be doing anyway. But the way I see it, there's kind of two sides, right? So for example, the guy who grows up and knows from a kid that he wanted to be a police officer and goes and chases that and feels fulfilled by it, that's one thing. But if you're kind of on autopilot and allowing the external to dictate what you do, it's like, is that what you were programmed for initially? Were you destined to be a bot?
Well, it's free will versus determinism. And I think that everything is a self-fulfilling prophecy regardless. So yes, whatever you are programmed with, you will end up becoming. But it's just whether you are consciously aware of what you're programmed with, or are you programming yourself to become something. The kid that believes he's going to be a police officer was programmed with that belief very early on. And so all the actions that followed suit were with this subconsciously in mind, or maybe even consciously, And so, yeah, you could say that was destiny, but you could also say it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, So I don't know where I land, to be honest, on free will and determinism, because there's a lot of things that feel canonical, things that were supposed to happen, paths were supposed to cross, but then a lot of the times I think it's down to you, and this is where the element of co-creation comes in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I also, last night I was watching your episode with Luke Belmar, and this concept of, got a lot from it, but this concept of what does it mean to know yourself, right? How do you think someone can actually know if they actually know themselves?
Great question. There's this idea of you can only meet people where they are, So you can only know I think it gets very philosophical and airy-fairy and doesn't really make sense with language, but you can only know the version of yourself that you perceive. Does that make sense?
Yeah. How would you say you can be more intentional about actually getting to know yourself, understanding yourself?
Spending a lot of time with yourself again. Yeah, I think it comes back to those practices of silence and contemplation and meditation and prayer and self-examination. I think these are fundamental practices, I think, that are just, they used to be integral. They used to be part of nature. Like they used to be, when you look at ancient tribes and whatnot, these were parts of the day that, were not to be missed. And I think that this is a lost art in the modern day. And I think that's a lot of the reason why there's so much identity crisis, today.
That makes sense. And when it comes to alignment specifically, firstly, what do you understand alignment to mean? Is it the same as purpose? Is it a different concept? Like,
I understand alignment to be, there's 3 parts of yourself, right? There's mind, body, spirit. And everyone has felt alignment in one sense or another. I'd compare it to flow states, a pocket of time in which everything was in cohesion. And so I think it's about the coherence of mind, body, and spirit. That's how I would define it.
And how can someone tell if they're in alignment? Is it just a feeling?
I think it's very similar to your intuition is driving the car, and you're aware. You are the passenger in this car.
And I wanted to ask you about conviction as a whole. So conviction comes from clarity and knowing what you want and going after it. Is there a way to develop conviction, to like summon it?
I think it begins with the belief, right, of what you want. And the conviction actually doesn't come until the last part. I think the belief and the thought will generate the action. The action will create evidence, and then the evidence will create conviction. And so I think it follows that cycle. I don't think you get to the conviction until you've built the evidence, to get there.
So is it possible to have conviction in something or in a direction, or that this is right for you without actually having done something to justify that to yourself?
I think there's levels of conviction. Some might have higher conviction than the others. And I think those that have high conviction in themselves is because they've built the evidence. But yeah, I think it's definitely possible to have conviction in the direction you want to go because you trust your intuitive knowing, okay, I know I'm meant to do this. And the more you walk that path, the stronger that conviction will become.
And, speaking of conviction, you brought up delusion before. I told you this, but I named this Delusion by Design in large part because of your use of the word and how it comes up. So, and what does delusion mean to you?
Yeah, it's really interesting because, I had a conversation with a friend about how delusion is not really delusion, to yourself. You don't have to delude yourself. It's only delusion to other people outside of yourself. And so it comes back to this idea of conviction. It sounds and feels delusional to everyone else. As long as it doesn't to yourself, then I think you're in the right place. And that's how you're going to get to where you're going to get to.
So delusion is only delusion to the external observer?
I believe so. Yeah, I believe so.
And how do you think someone can develop or apply that if they don't currently feel it towards anything?
Or you have to choose the direction to go into, obviously. And I think that's where the experimentation comes in. There's this question of should you be a generalist or a specialist, right? What do you think?
I think it kind of depends on the path you want to take. Specialists will, at least pre-AI, tend to be paid quite well and be able to solve specific problems and be able to, niche down and really focus on that one thing, whereas generalists might be better applied for many different roles and be able to be more flexible, more chameleon-like. That might be easier to find opportunities, possibly harder to make themselves invaluable to a company or place. As a generalist, I guess more of a generalist myself, I would lean towards that, but I don't know. I don't know if there's a right answer either.
I don't think you can become a specialist until you are a generalist. I think you have to go through trying multiple things until you find what you have conviction in being a specialist in. And so, to answer your question, you can find your delusion by experimentation, through becoming a generalist, through skill stacking, through trying multiple things, and then finding, okay, this is the thing that pulls at me. And I think a lot of it comes through doing.
Yeah, there was even, I remember back in one of Iman's original courses, he had this concept of the T-shaped entrepreneur, which I've always kind of taken with me, where it's like you're a generalist in the sense that you know how to do a bunch of things, but you're a specialist in that one thing, which forms like the T.
So he got that from Sam Ovens, I believe.
There you go.
Yeah.
And delusion as a concept, do you think there's a point where it ever stops being useful? Can be harmful?
I think there's living in avoidance, and I think that's a different thing. I think living in avoidance is synonymous with delusion, because that is being afraid to confront your own patterns or your own decisions you're making and avoiding accountability, and that's where I think it can become dangerous. Yeah, but as a whole, I think delusion will serve you more than it will harm you if it's directed and channeled into the pursuit of something that is, the betterment of yourself.
Do you feel like you've ever been delusional about the wrong thing?
Good question. Yes, but when I look back, it's this whole butterfly effect thing, like I don't regret anything I did because ultimately I wouldn't be here otherwise. So not including the butterfly effect, if I could go back and change things, then yeah, certainly there's paths that I thought I saw for myself that I deluded myself that this was the way, and it wasn't. But again, ultimately it led me to where I am now. So I don't think it is harmful.
Because it ended up serving you.
Yeah.
Something you speak about as well is mastery, right? So self-mastery primarily, but I wanted to touch on mastery over emotion, right? So would you say there's a difference between being in control of your emotions and numbing yourself to emotions?
Yeah, for sure. I think a great example of this is within one of the ancient texts called the Upanishads. And in there's an example of the horse and his chariot. And it's a metaphor. So the chariot acts as the body, right? The horses are your senses and emotions. The reins are your mind. The charioteer is your higher intellect. And the thing that truly matters is the self, the passenger. And so the charioteer, the intellect, always has control over the reins. But if your emotions are dysregulated, you don't regulate your emotions, then it can become very dangerous very quickly because the horses are in control. And that's what leads to, well, a lot of the problems that we see today. When emotion is at the driver's seat, and that's the thing that's in control, that's where impulse decisions come in. That's how people spiral. And so there's an element to regaining control as the mind and the intellect, but then ultimately seeing yourself even beyond that as the observer. And I think that's the best way I could create as a metaphor.
As controlling your emotions, right?
Yeah. Oh, to answer your question, numbing them. Again, I think that's a matter of avoidance. You know, not confronting patterns and trying to numb them with external influences, whether it's alcohol or, you know, any sort of stimulant. That is when things can become dangerous and nihilistic. Yeah. Because emotions are, as far as I know, meant to be felt. You know, one thing Luke said in the episode with me that I definitely agree with is that you're meant to experience the entire spectrum of emotions. Like, you're not meant to be happy all the time or sad all the time. You're meant to experience the whole entire spectrum. And so numbing yourself to that is kind of voiding yourself with the human experience.
Do you think there are any emotions that it could be useful to shut off or avoid or build a different relationship with in general, or is it really just a case of allowing yourself to feel through all of them?
I think what you said there, the second thing, building a different relationship with them, it's a matter of where do you stand in relation to this thing. That's how you build a different relationship to it. And again, it comes back to that notion of you're the passenger in the chariot. You're not anything else. You know, so when you take that seat as the observer, then you can change your position in relation to that specific feeling or emotion.
And is there a time and place to actually like shut off emotion in general, right? Because you were mentioning business before, right? And you know, you need to be logical, you need to be calculating, you need to be able to make rational decisions.
Yeah.
And at times, you know, the personal side, ego, emotions in general might get involved. So is it a case of shutting it off for those kinds of instances, or again, just like acknowledging them, but being able to act regardless?
Well, what is ego?
That's a whole separate point that I wanted to touch on with you as well. But I would say ego is the voice in your head, whereas you are the observer.
Okay, well, I think it's interesting observation. For me, I think, what's the etymology of ego? It's just I, myself, right? The Greek word. There's nothing wrong with that. But when it becomes a problem is when these layers of identity get in the way of who you truly are, like the awareness of who you truly are. And this is a whole another topic of what is consciousness and what is the self, and however far you want to go into that rabbit hole. And so when these layers of identity that you've collected begin taking the reins and taking control, I think that's when, you know, the problem starts to occur. So again, it's getting back to that seat of the observer of okay, what's in control right now? You know, what's the narrative I'm telling myself in this moment? How am I reacting to this event that has just occurred, whether it's a fire in the business? I think you can say consciously that you know, in some seasons you have to turn off emotions, but I wouldn't consider it turning them off. I would consider it a reframe of what you believe those emotions to be.
Yeah, because I've also seen emotion basically broken down into energy and motion.
Yeah.
Right? So how would you say someone can actually use emotion positively to help drive them towards whatever it is that they're looking to do?
Well, if you want to talk about vibration and frequency and, you know, getting yourself to a spiritual state of where you are most likely to succeed, I think that's where this sort of idea of affirmation and repetition sort of comes in. And for me, what I found to be the most valuable practice is understanding when your mind is operating in theta waves, which is when you're most suggestible. Your subconscious mind is most suggestible. And in doing those practices in those moments that will bring you to those higher states of emotion, you know, higher states of frequency. If you look at there's a guy called David Hawkins. He wrote Power versus Force. And there's a map of consciousness in there. And it's something I reference in my work a lot. And if you look at the spectrum of emotion, you know, what's right at the top is enlightenment. But beneath that is joy and happiness. And everything that descends, is fear, judgment, shame, guilt. Yeah. And so in those moments where you're most suggestible is where I think you can use this frequency training, if you want to call it, to your advantage, and training yourself to get into those higher states of emotion and to remain there. And, it sounds like such a cliche answer, but having a real gratitude practice is what me personally brings me to those higher states of being. Having something that drives me, that is not just for me, and that's a whole other thing. Doing your work in service of something higher. That is also what brings me to this higher state. Even having conversations like this, it brings you to a higher state,
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, even on that briefly, I'm not asking specifically about your personal beliefs, but I know you've read a lot of religious texts. I know you've kind of tapped into a whole spectrum of, again, knowledge from different cultures, practices, followings, etc. How have you learned to view religion or the knowledge and wisdom that religion can bring as a whole?
Well, I think there's a through line in everything, in every practice, and it depends. A very universalist view is, let's say, someone like Muhammad Ali, who said that there are lakes, there are rivers, there are ponds, but ultimately they all lead to one thing, which is the ocean. So there are different bodies of the same thing and carry the same principles, but ultimately they are reflections of the same thing. And if you take the universalist view, then I think that's what religion really kind of boils down to. But I would kind of separate religion and spirituality into two different things, because spirituality doesn't promote separation or division. And it's not to say that something is right or something is wrong. But the through line, like I said in the beginning, I think is this this awareness, this, how would you define what consciousness is? Hard question, but just out of interest.
I would define consciousness as the awareness of self within the context of, where you are, who you are, and
who you are. So but how do you define who you are?
I think it goes back to what I said for ego, as in the voice, you being the observer rather than the actual voice.
The one that hears it, right? Yeah. And I think it's the same. I think the truth that I found in all of these different religions or spirituality texts and whatnot is the awareness that I am. And even Jesus says in the Bible that truly I say unto you, before Abraham I am, And I think this is the through line in what these spiritual texts are trying to tell you. When you deconstruct the self, that's all that remains. There's this idea that I learned about recently, I don't want to butcher it, but it's called mereological nihilism. And essentially what it means is that everything is made up of the same fundamental parts, right? The same simples. We don't know what those simples are. That could be protons or quarks or whatever it may be. But everything is a different arrangement of these things. Like this table and this chair has the same simples, fundamentals. And so when you look at consciousness as a construct, or the self as a construct, what's the difference between a rich man and a poor man? They have the same consciousness in a different arrangement. And so I think a lot of that's why a lot of the work that I point to is about changing this arrangement and understanding that we act as filters, from this source. And we all have a different sort of arrangement. So it might be a roundabout way of saying it, but yeah.
And the filter comes back to perception of self and identity and the mind.
Yeah, I think your filter develops, as you grow. And who knows? I had this conversation with a friend. I think the filter might be necessary so you don't lose your mind. A state of enlightenment might mean your filter's gone. Who knows?
Do you think someone can say they've truly mastered their emotions without being tested in some way?
Yeah, not at all. Yeah, I think a test is required. How do you know that you know something? In school, you go through tests, exams. It's the same in life. Whatever principles you say that you hold, that you say that you've mastered, life will throw you situations in order to give you a test and say, okay, cool. You say you've mastered emotional regulation. Let me throw something your way, you know. And in those moments, I think you find out who you really are. There's this quote, I forgot who said it, or this idea, and it was, a man finds out who he is in times of crisis. You know, and I think, that's how you find out.
Yeah, that's when it shows you. And do you consider self-mastery to be exclusively mastery over emotions, or are there different types or aspects to it?
It's a great question. No, I don't think it's primarily emotions. I think, again, it comes back to those three elements, you know, of mind, body, spirit. It's nurturing each part, understanding that there are three components of the whole. You know, you can get into this whole idea of three if you want to, of like, there's the Trinity, there's everything for some reason boils down into three. There's the Trinity in Vedic beliefs, there's creator, preserver, destroyer, you know, there's solid, liquid, gas, there's everything for some reason. Jesus was 33 when he died, there's 33 vertebrae in the spine. Anyway, that's a whole other rabbit hole. But I think nurturing each part is where the sort of mastery comes in. And I'm not claiming to have any sort of expertise. Again, I'm not a guru, but this is what I've discovered as the through line.
And just because you mentioned it, I promised myself I'd bring it up, but essentially the other day I was looking into astrology and numerology properly for the first time. And without digging into specifics of it, do you think it can be useful to use astrology or numerology as a tool in life?
Yeah, sure. I think God has infinite ways of communication, even infinite languages, infinite avenues of communication. And so if the messages you receive is through numerology and astrology, then so be it. That's kind of how I see it. I think ultimately humans understand things in terms of stories and symbols. If you go back and look at Jung's work, everything is about storytelling and symbols and archetypes. And I think numerology or astrology, when you resonate with a specific star sign, for example, that could just be your way of understanding the same insight you would get from, you know, another scripture or another spiritual text. You know, so I don't think anything is necessarily right or wrong.
Do you think there is a way someone can use them positively and, again, use them as a tool to help themselves or understand themselves?
Yeah, I think so. I think, again, if it plants the seed in your mind of, okay, so a lot of horoscopes are very generic, let's say, but it could plant the seed in your mind of that week something good is going to happen to you. And because that seed is planted, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and you'll go and, it's confirmation bias, you'll go and look for something good to happen to you. And so in that way, it can be positively used.
Do you think it can be dangerous to let them kind of play a role in your self-image?
Yeah, I think ultimately relying on anything external is not the answer, in my opinion. You know, I think every spiritual text ultimately comes down to the answers have been inside of you this entire time, you know, and you have to go inward instead of outward.
And when it comes to self-image generally, and you just said inward instead of outward, but do you think it should all come from within and clarity should all come from within? Or is there ever a time to allow kind of external influence to guide and help determine the direction?
I think there's definitely room for external, external feeds the internal. So it's the consumption cycle. Whatever you consume, you know, it sits in your mind, in your subconscious, and that can shape your beliefs. And technically that's come from the external, you know, but it's come from someone else's internal. So it depends how deep you want to go into what's internal, what's external. But I believe, yes, it definitely can serve you to use external and internal influences to guide and create your self-image, because whatever self-image you project onto the screen of, you know, reality, that's ultimately what reality will mirror back to you in terms of experience and opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, this is the last of the big points that I wanted to cover with you, but just in terms of ego, I know we've already covered some specific points, but what does having a healthy ego or healthy relationship with your ego look like to you?
Yeah, there's this, again, like neo-spirituality, modern spirituality has this idea that the ego has to be killed, right? And I don't think we are given anything innately to kill. I think it's something that needs to be integrated in a healthy way, right? And so ego can serve you in some cases in the pursuit of certain goals. You know, whether it's being an athlete, you have to believe that you're that guy, or being in business that you want to outperform other people. It can serve you in that case. And I think there's a line between confidence and self-respect and like when you step over that line, you know. So I think when ego is inward facing in a way where it's aiding you in your development without causing external harm, I think that's a healthy integrated ego.
Yeah. It's funny because sometimes a big ego or a strong ego can show up in different ways depending on the context, right? So
Yeah,
the same ego that might serve you as an athlete to actually push you to your goals might be the one that destroys your relationships with your closest friends.
absolutely. And you know, an interesting point is there's this rugby player called Johnny Wilkinson, and he was on stage speaking recently. I went to see, and he said that where he is right now in his life, he couldn't be practicing the same sort of mental practices he had back then because it would completely destroy his life today. And so it serves exactly to that point. In that season that he was in, absolutely served him to win a World Cup. But today, maybe not. And I think that's the evolution.
I think that also kind of plays to learning from people who are ahead of you, but learning from the version of them that was where you are as opposed to where they are now, right?
Yeah, model the rise, not the destination, as Chris Williamson says.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly that. So, I mean, you touched on this in terms of neo-spirituality is a term I really like, by the way. But you mentioned how it's something that essentially advocates for dissolving the ego, destroying the ego. And the question I had was if you think there's time that people should have their ego strengthened. And if you were to approach kind of strengthening your ego, I don't know if you'd read that as strengthening conviction as well.
Yeah.
But how would you approach that?
It's a difficult question. I think in different circumstances, this will serve you, right? Yeah, I would compare it to strengthening conviction. And I think strengthening conviction, again, is the process of constant output and feedback that, you know, it's a feedback loop, essentially. And so, I don't know, it's a difficult question. How would you approach it?
Strengthening conviction, I think.
Strengthen. When do you think it would serve you to strengthen your ego?
I think it would serve you in situations where if you don't stand up for yourself, you're gonna kind of die on the beach, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so like self-respect in a way as well. Right?
Yeah, self-respect.
Having barriers and boundaries.
Exactly. So whether that's like, you know, the middle school playground or, you know, if you're in a cutthroat industry that you need to kind of stand up for yourself there, or even, I don't know, if you're in pursuit of something specific or someone specific, you need to be able to see yourself as worthy.
Yeah. And I think also not allowing yourself to be manipulated into positions, you know, like 48 laws of power, everyone kind of speaks down on it. But ultimately, it's a great resource for knowing when these tools are being used against you. And actually, when you read it through, it's so obvious when it's kind of being done to you. And so in that case, I think strengthening your own ego or conviction would serve you.
And even in terms of being able to use them for yourself, like, of course, there's, you know, applications of it where you're being manipulative and you're, you know, objectively negative with your approach. But I do think there are ways to convince people or portray things in a certain way that is a net positive, not just for yourself, but for others as well. So, yeah, bro, I mean, you know, to start kind of wrapping up, I know that you have turned down a lot of podcast requests. I know that you have a lot going on with your own show as well. So, yeah, I just want to say super grateful and appreciative of having the chance to come on and mentally spar with you on these debates.
I appreciate it. Again, I think it's a reflection of, you know, your character. I think one thing that is insanely difficult to find is a level of confidence and competence and initiative. And I think you embody both those things, bro. Even in the way in which you approach this and you approach me as well, it was next to none. So I appreciate that, and I don't see this as a favor or anything. I see it as a conversation I actually wanted to have. You know.
I'm grateful, bro. Really appreciate that, and yeah, I've loved it. But to start taking us through, what's next for Milan?
Next is, you know, depending on when this comes out, I guess. I always have this saying that investing in me and my team and the show now is like buying Bitcoin early, So I think the aim is to build the biggest and best show and provide education on a level, or entertainment and edutainment on a level that kind of hasn't been done before artistically. New and more interesting guests, creative sets, artistic direction, and then a couple of things I'm working on in the background with some projects and businesses that we're building.
I love that, bro. Yeah, and you mentioned investing in you and your team now is like investing in Bitcoin back in the day, and honestly, I back that a lot as well. And I've said this to you before, but for me, since I met you like 3 years ago at this point, and kind of seen the journey and seen the value that you share and the principles you live by and you embody, I've always had a huge amount of respect for them and value your wisdom, your input, your knowledge as well. So
thank you, bro. Appreciate the love.
So yeah, bro, super, super grateful. Just a couple finishers I always like to ask as well. If you could speak to a past version of yourself that was going through a tough time, whatever that was, might have come up in this conversation, might have not, what message would you have to give them?
So a quote I use very often in my newsletters is from Steve Jobs, and I think he said it in his Harvard speech and whatnot. He said that you cannot connect the dots looking forward, but you can connect them looking backwards. And so to touch on the point of it will all make sense in the end, I think I always remind myself of, okay, the dot I'm currently at right now, it might not make sense in the moment, but looking back, I'm going to understand why it was completely necessary. And so I believe life has this trail that you follow in which you're constantly moving towards the next dot and connecting the next dot. And when you look back, hindsight is 2020. But the skill, I think, is being able to train yourself to have the foresight that it will make sense in hindsight.
Beautifully put. Yeah. Do you think it's valid to look for meaning in all these things and everything that happens to you, or is it just a case of allowing it to make sense in hindsight then?
Yeah, meaning's an interesting one because you can spiral into what's meaning and what's not. Like if you trip over outside and you ask yourself, oh, why did that happen? What's the dot this is trying to tell me or connect to? Something's just happened, So again, I think this is the skill of discernment. But the major inflection points, I think that occur in your life, I think there is a meaning to be found in all of them.
And if you had to leave the audience with one final thought that would best sum up the message you put out with your work, what would that be?
Yeah, I think it's what I led with in the beginning, that the successful pursuit of anything external first begins with the internal pursuit of mastery. So if you focus on building those foundations, on building a strong, impenetrable mind, then I think not only is the success that you're going to have inevitable, but it will be long-lasting and it will be fulfilling. And you'll be attached to the process itself and not to the fruits. And I think I can see it in your own work, in what you're doing. I can see you genuinely enjoy doing this. And the concept I speak about often is that, detachment from the outcome and attachment to the process, and detachment from the fruits of what you do. And so that is ultimately what the work of internal mastery is. I think it's a never-ending pursuit, that there's no results that bear fruit that you can sort of tangibly grab onto, but eventually you look back and you think, oh wow, I've come a long way. So yeah, that's what I would leave them with.
Beautifully put. Yeah, it's the process itself.
Yeah.
Oh, amazing. Bro, really appreciate you coming on once again. Very much enjoyed this conversation.
Likewise, bro.
And yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing where you take things, how things progress. And it's what I told you last time I was with you. I'm sure 2026 is going to be the year where things click and you start getting up there in the numbers that I believe the work you already do kind of deserves to be at.
I appreciate it, bro. Thank you so much. Thanks for everything you've done. And again, like I said, the level of competence is evident. So I appreciate that.
Thank you, bro. But yeah, with that being said, if you want to watch another of these conversations with someone who has applied some of the principles that Milan and I spoke about in his own life, his own journey, and had tangible material success with it, you can watch my podcast with Muhiz right here.